Hello everyone, welcome back to kodEdge. In today's video, we will explore how to implement authorization in API Gateway using Cognito User Pool. By default, API Gateway doesn't provide any built-in authorization mechanism. That means any client can call the APIs that you create in the API Gateway. So we will address this by securing our API Gateway using Cognito. So let's take a look at the architecture. So we have API Gateway with Lambda function integrated as its backend. Then we will create a Cognito user pool for both authentication and authorization purpose. So the user flow will be user first authenticate themselves through Cognito and obtains a token. The user then call the API from the API gateway. During this call, the user will include the obtained token in the request header for authorization purpose. Once the API gateway receives the request, it verifies the token with the help of Cognito. If the token is valid, API gateway forward the request and invoke the Lambda function. Then Lambda function returns the response back to the client. So I have already created video on integration of API gateway with the Lambda function, in which I have created the REST API which invokes the Lambda function. In this video, I have explained each and every step in detail. So I recommend watching this video. I will also attach its link in the video description. Still, I will give you small recap in the hands-on. So let's move in the hands-on. So in the lecture 6, we saw that how to integrate Lambda function with the API gateway. So this was a script that we have created in the lecture 6. So let me give you a small recap. So first we created the Lambda function. So in the function, we use the environment variable that we are going to provide from the Terraform script. Then we created the response with the status code as a 200. We included the header with the content type as a application JSON. Then we return the simple string message from this function. Okay, so this was our Lambda function. Then in the script, we use this Lambda function and created the zip file. So type was zip. Source file was the index.js that we created in the Lambda directory. And then we created the zip file in this output path that is in the same Lambda directory. After that, we created the IAM role for the Lambda function. So we created the separate file for defining the role. So file name was lambda-policy.json. And in this file, we defined the role. So we defined the action as assume role with the effect as allow, and principal was Lambda function. Okay. Then we use this JSON file in the IAM role resource. So this is how you can use the JSON file using file function. Okay. So this is how we created the IAM role for the Lambda function. Then we attach the policy to this IAM role, and we attach the AWS Lambda basic execution role for this IAM role. Now to attach this policy to this IAM role, for that purpose, what we did, we use the role attribute here, and we use the role name, that is this name, Lambda role. After that, we created the actual Lambda resource. So here we use the file name that will be index.zip that we have created here. Okay. Then this was our function name, that was demo Lambda function. Then this was the role for the Lambda function, and we get this role from this resource, that is AWS IAM role dot Lambda role, that is a resource name dot ARN. Then handler means this is the name of the Lambda function. The next attribute was runtime. So we are using Node.js 20.x as a runtime. Then this was a timeout we defined, that is 30. Then this is a source code hash. This is how you can define the source code hash. So I have already explained all this in detail in that previous lecture. And this is how you can provide the environment variable to the Lambda function. Then we created the API gateway. So this is how you can create the API gateway resource. So we have created the REST API in the API gateway. So this was the name for the API. This was the description, and this was the endpoint configuration type. So we created the regional API. Then we created the resource in this API. So this was the parent ID that we use from this resource. Okay. Then this was the path part. So this was a demo -path that I have given for the APIs. Then this is a REST API ID, and this you can get from this resource. So you need to define the resource type, that is AWS API Gateway REST API that we have created here. Dot the resource name, that is YT API. Dot ID for the REST API ID, and root resource ID for the parent ID. After that, we created the method which is of the type post. in this resource. So here as well use the resource ID. Resource ID will come from this AWS API Gateway resource dot resource name dot ID. Then this is a REST API ID. So this you can get from this API Gateway REST API resource. Then HTTP method. So we are creating post type method and the authorization was none. So in this section, we are going to do changes for the configuring Cognito user pool. Then this was the integration type that we defined for the Lambda. So HTTP method that we get from this resource, that is AWS API Gateway method dot resource name, that is YT method dot HTTP method that we have defined here. Then resource ID and the REST API ID, this will be the same like in the previous resource. Then integration HTTP method was post. Type was AWS proxy. So whatever the response, Lambda will return to the API gateway. API gateway will return that response back to the user. And this was the URI of the Lambda function. So you can get this URI using AWS Lambda function resource type that we have defined here. Okay. Dot resource name, that is YT Lambda function. Okay. Dot invoke ARN. So this is how you can get the URI. Then I have explained the custom response that you can customize your response that you get from the Lambda function, and you can return that customized response back to the user. So I have commented this part because this is out of scope for this lecture. After that, we created the stage. So we created the stage using the AWS API Gateway deployment resource. This was the resource name, and this was the REST API ID that we get from the API Gateway REST API resource. Then stage name be given as a dev. And these are the triggers that we mentioned. So whenever there is a change in these particular resources, it will do the redeployment of the configuration on the dev stage. After that, we configure the life cycle. We use this attribute for that create before destroy equal to true. Then we define the dependency for this resource. Then we created the permission for the API gateway to invoke the Lambda function. You can create the resource of the type AWS Lambda permission. So this was the name for the resource, and we are allowing to invoke the Lambda function. This was the function name that we have created. Principal was API gateway dot amazonaws.com. What is the meaning of this? We are allowing AWS API gateway to invoke the Lambda function. Okay, and this is the action, that is Lambda invoke function. Then after that, we created the output variable which will output the deployment path, that is API path. Okay, so this is what we configured in the previous lecture. Now next we will configure the Cognito user pool. So let me create a new folder for the current lecture, that will be lecture 7. Okay, and let me copy all this configuration because we are going to use all this configuration again. Okay, so let me create a new file for the Cognito user pool configuration. So I am giving name as a cognito.tf. Okay, so you can give any name as per your requirement. I am giving as a cognito.tf. So how to create a Cognito user pool? So let me open AWS console and let's see what all configuration required to create the Cognito user pool. Let's search for the Cognito. And let me click on the create user pool. So here provider type, we are going to use Cognito user pool for our demonstration. And Cognito user pool sign in option, so I am going to use username. Okay, let me click on the next. So here you can define the password policy. Okay, so this is how you can define the password policy. We are going to define this policy in our Terraform script. Then here multi-factor authentication option. So here we are going to use no MFA. So let's configure all this configuration in the Terraform script. So let me open the IntelliJ. So let's create the resource for the Cognito user pool. So how to create the resource? You can use the keyword resource. Then the resource type will be AWS Cognito user pool. And user pool name will be YT Cognito pool. So you can give any name as per your requirement. So here as well, I am giving name as a YT Cognito pool. So next argument will be to define the password policy. So let's use the attribute minimum length. So I'm giving length as a 8. Okay. The next requirement is required lowercase. So I'm making it as a false for now. The next attribute is required uppercase. I am making it as a false. The next policy you can give required number. I am making it as a false. The next attribute you can give required symbols. I am making it as a false. So for demonstration purpose, I am giving the simple password policy. You can change this policy as per your requirement. Okay. So we have successfully created the Cognito User Pool resource. Now next we will create the Cognito User Client. So for that purpose, you can create the resource. Resource name will be AWS Cognito User Pool Client. And name I am giving as a YT User Pool Client. So you can give any name as per your requirement. And this will be the identity provider for the Cognito User Pool. So name I am giving same as a YT User Pool Client. So what will be the user pool ID? So let's copy this resource type, that is AWS Cognito User Pool dot resource name, that is YT Cognito Pool dot ID. The next attribute will be to allow the OAuth protocol. So attribute name will be allow auth-flow user pool client, and I'm making it as a true. So what is the meaning of this? So it will allow to use the OAuth protocol when interacting with the Cognito user pool. Next attribute I am using as a allow auth flows, and here I am allowing code and implicit. Next attribute I am using as a allow auth scope, and scope will be AWS Cognito sign in user admin. So this is giving the admin permission. Next attribute I am using as a supported identity provider. So here supported identity provider I am providing as a Cognito. The next attribute I am providing as a explicit authorization flow. So here I am providing authorization flow as a admin no SRP auth and user password auth. So what is the meaning of admin no SRP auth? That means non-SRP authentication flow. And this is username and password authentication flow. Next attribute I am providing for the callback URL. So here I am providing callback URL as a example.com for the demonstration purpose. And the last attribute I am using as a prevent user existing error as a enable. Now next we will create the variable for the username and the password. So let's use the keyword variable. So variable name I am giving as a user name. So type will be string, and I am marking this variable as a sensitive. Okay, let's create the next variable for the password. Now next we will create the user in the Cognito user pool, and in that resource we will use the username and the password. So let's use the keyword resource. Resource type will be AWS Cognito user, and this will be the username that I am giving, that is YT underscore user. So what is user pool ID? So you can get from this resource, that is AWS Cognito user pool. So resource type will be AWS Cognito user pool dot resource name, that is YT Cognito pool dot ID. And here let's provide this variable, that is username. So how to give that variable? Var dot username, like this. And let's give the password using var dot password, like this. So this is how you can create the user in the Cognito user pool. Now we are not going to save this username and password in this script. We are going to provide this variable using the environment variable. So let me open the terminal and let's use the command export. And how to pass the environment variable? So you can use the keyword tf underscore var underscore your variable name, that is username. So I'm giving username as a test. Then let's provide the password as well. So let's use the keyword export tf underscore var underscore variable name, that is password. Okay, so I'm giving simple password, that will be abcd@1234. Okay, so this variable is going to use automatically when we execute this script in the AWS. Now next we will integrate this Cognito User Pool with the API Gateway. For that purpose, let's create the resource. Resource type will be AWS API Gateway Authorizer. And this is the name I am giving for the resource. So let me use the same name here. The next attribute is REST API ID. So how to get this API ID? So let's go back into the API Gateway configuration and let's find the resource API Gateway REST API. Okay, so just copy this resource type, that is AWS API Gateway REST API dot resource name, that is YT API dot ID. Then next will be the type. Type will be Cognito User Pool. Then let's provide the provider ARM. So what will be the provider ARM? So let's copy the resource type, that is Cognito User Pool dot resource name, that is YT Cognito Pool dot ARM. Okay, so this is the provider for the authorizer. Now let's go back into the AWS API Gateway configuration and just find the resource, that is AWS API Gateway method. And here we have mentioned that authorization equal to none. So we need to change this to the Cognito User Pool. Next, we will provide the authorizer ID. So how to get this authorizer ID? So you can use the resource type that we have just created, AWS API Gateway Authorizer, in the resource name dot ID. So this is the resource that we have created in the cognito.tf file, that is AWS API Gateway Authorizer, and this was the resource name. So we are using the same resource type and the resource name for the authorizer ID purpose. And this is how you can integrate the Cognito User Pool with the API Gateway. And let's apply this configuration in the AWS. So let me open the terminal. So first we will initialize the provider. So let me open the provider.tf file. So here we are using provider as a AWS, and this is the default region I am using for the demonstration purpose. So let's initialize the provider using Terraform init command. So let me cd into the lecture 7 folder and let's run the command terraform init. Okay, so our provider is initialized successfully. Let's apply this configuration using command terraform apply. So it is going to add 13 resources. So let me enter yes. Okay, so all the resources created successfully. And this is our API URL. So let's verify all the resources in the AWS console. So let's go into the Cognito User Pool. Let me refresh it. Okay, so this is the user pool that we have created. And if you see, this is our user, that is a test user. And let's go into the API Gateway. So this is our first API, that is YT API, in which we have created this resource. And in this resource, we have created this post method. And this is the integration with the Lambda function. Now, if you see, it has an authorizer, that is API Gateway Authorizer. And this is the integration that we did using the Terraform script. Okay. Now it requires the token value. So how to get this token value? So let's call that URL first from the testing tool. Let me copy that URL. So this is our API URL. So path will be demo-path. Request type will be post. And let me click on the send. So you can see we are getting message as a unauthorized. Okay. So what we required, we need to provide the token in the request. So how to get that token? So let's go back into the AWS console and let's click on this icon here. So let me open this in the new window. So here we will generate the token using our username and the password. So for that purpose, you can use this command. So you can get this command from the AWS documentation. So what I'm using, AWS cognito-idp admin-initiate-auth. The next attribute is the region. So let me provide the region. So region we are using AP South 1. Then what is the user pool ID? So let's go back into the AWS console. Let me close this. Search for the Cognito. So this is our user pool ID. Just copy this user pool ID here and just replace here. Then next is the client ID. Let's go back into the Cognito. Click on the user pool name. And if you go into the app integration section, and here you will find the client. Okay, so you can find the app client list. So click on the app client name here, that is YT user pool client. So you can get client ID from here as well, or if you click, you can copy from here as well. Let's use that client ID here. So what is the auth-flow? Auth-flow will be admin no SRP auth. The next are the authentication parameters, that is username and the password. So username we have given as a test. And what is the password that we have given? That is abcd@1234. Okay. So if you remember, we created the variable in the Terraform script here, right? And we exported this variable using the environment variable command. Okay. So let's execute this command. So here you can get the tokens. So this is the access token. This is the token type. This is the refresh token. And this is the ID token. So let's copy the ID token here. And let's go back into the AWS console. Let's search for the API gateway. And let's go into the API. And let's go into the authorizers option here. So this is the authorizer. So let's click on this authorizer and use that token value that we have copied from here. Okay. So we are using ID token for the authorizer. And let's click on the test authorizer. You can see it is returning the status code as a 200. Okay. So let's use this token in the API as well. So let's go back into the API and let's add the new header, that is authorization. And let's add the new keyword, that is bearer. And let's use the same ID token that we have copied from this command. Okay. And let me click on the send. Now you can see we are getting message from the Lambda function. Okay. So this is how you can secure your APIs using the Cognito user pool. Now once you're done with the practice, let's run the command terraform destroy. So it will destroy all the resources that we have created in the demonstration. Okay, so that's it for this lecture. Thanks for watching the video.